which of the recommendations do you see as the most important for occupier safety? And in your experience, have you seen lots of existing good practice across risk management? If I come to Mark first.
Yeah, so I think this builds on what I was saying already. And I think for me, the golden thread isn't just about information. That's vital, but it's almost like it's a cultural issue. It's something about how everybody who's dealing with the whole process of building and managing and maintaining the building, how everybody thinks in their heads. It's like the golden thread's up here rather than in the computer or in a box on the wall. That's just a physical manifestation of what everybody is actually doing and thinking, and the information's only as good as what we put in and how we maintain it. So it's really important that the culture changes. I mean, just giving my experience when I was working Tower Hamlets, and we were going out to buildings that had been built maybe 10 years ago. Then they weren't ancient buildings, but to find the information about what was actually constructed, what products were used, quite often what was submitted for planning, or even what was in an early submission in terms of drawings of what is going to be built, wasn't what was built. Things change, decisions are made right at the last minute to change a product, to save money, value engineering, whatever you want to call it. And so that grip on what is actually built and is then maintained, and how products are introduced during the life of the building through refurbishment and so on, is so vital. And having it in everybody's awareness that that information is critical to the safety of the people who live in that building, that to me is the #1 issue.
Thank you. So it's kind of cultural shifts, as well as thinking and just implementing the process, which is probably written down somewhere, may need to be rewritten in a new way that is made accessible to everybody. Thanks, Mark. Alan, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are existing obviously there are existing regimes in place around fire safety, and principally in terms of in occupation is the Fire Safety Reform Order and the Housing Act 2004. Now, in terms of the interaction between local housing authorities and fire and rescue services, there are currently local agreements in place generally around who will lead on particular issues. The Fire Safety Reform Order itself is going to add further clarification around both the roles of the fire and rescue service in relation to the common parts, and likewise the fire risk assessments themselves, and how fire risk assessments, certainly under current under current reform order principles, will involve the external facade of the building as well, including any balconies, cladding, any external windows as well. So it's really going to clarify those areas, and around fire doors to the flats themselves. So it might enable, the clarification that might influence how local housing authorities and fire and rescue services interact in terms of lead authorities in particular areas. Obviously, local housing authorities, they as well as fire safety and structural safety, which is some of the main areas covered by the Building Safety and Fire Safety Reform, do have other issues around, habitation requirements in properties themselves and housing conditions and standards. So it'll be interesting to see that. I think they are still planning to go for locally agreed, plans that are in place between the regulatory regimes, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of the common areas and the external envelope of the building themselves. One of the reasons that the fire addendum was added was because there was uncertainty around whether the Fire Safety Reform Order actually applied to the external facade of the building, and it was seen that the Housing Act 2004 could really fill that gap in terms of enabling control and enforcement, and it kind of went away from the usual approach of looking at flats per se and attaching common parts to that, to really looking at the Housing Act 2004 and seeing the common parts as an area of assessment that could be undertaken in its own right. So it'll be interesting to see how the interaction between the regulatory authorities is clarified more than just with the Fire and Rescue Service through certainly the Fire Safety Bill itself, and how new powers that are available to the Building Safety Regulator or proposed powers around the ability to appoint special measures managers, where they feel that management within a building is not up to the standard that it should be. So it'll be interesting to see how the regulatory regimes, all of which will continue in a similar way, and with the addition of the building safety regulator will play out. I think residents, in terms of resident engagement, is as well as the management, which is something that we've already touched on. Resident engagement and the resident engagement strategies is something where good practice is really going to come into the fold that bit more as a standard that should be applied to all buildings, around strong partnerships with residents, the overall engagement with residents, complaints handling, and also the information provision that goes on with the residents themselves as well.
You, I think we'll come back into that in a bit more detail later, and that actually leads nicely into the next regulatory question, which is more on this, and it's that the government have begun a wholesale review of HHSRS, including the setting of the new standards. What do you see as the key interactions between HHSRS and the fire safety order regulatory regimes? And we've spoken a bit already about enforcement and fire safety bill. Could you expand on that, Alan, before we come back to you, Mark?
Yeah, I think in terms of the fire addendum was one of the early measures that was put in place, as I've already touched on, to plug that gap almost between the assessment of the common areas themselves, which includes the external common parts. A lot of the information that feeds into that will be management related information. So it will be information that's available around the construction of the elements themselves. When I talk elements, I'm talking your windows, doors, your walls, your insulation, those type of elements. So it's almost allowed us to approach common parts in their own right. Naturally, in terms of the multi-occupied high-rise buildings that I've assessed, you were certainly looking at assessing in the common parts against structural safety and fire safety. Those are the two natural areas that apply to the common areas that maybe don't apply, although they do apply within the flats themselves. That there are other areas within the flats themselves you're actually looking at. So from the reform perspective, there is a hint of looking at standards within the reform, whereas now it's very much led on the effects of the defects on individuals and assessing the risk and looking at preventative measures to reduce those risks. Standards are being looked at. I'm not a fan of using the term minimum standards myself, but the standards more generally within buildings to help inform and interact with the HHSRS. And part of that is looking at fire safety standards as well. So there is talk about renewing the guidance, as well as renewing the guidance within the HHSRS. There is talk around reforming the guidance that's applicable to the fire safety reform order as well. So there's probably an opportunity here to gain some real consistency between the approaches taken by local authorities in terms of fire safety, taken by the fire authority in terms of the guidance that feeds into that, and likewise the building safety regulator information that and any consistency that can be given across the board there would be welcomed. Certainly in terms of where the HHSRS is going, there's a real want from authorities to have additional information and guidance around the high-rise buildings, multi-occupied buildings, worked examples that helps feed into the assessments. I've already touched on competency frameworks that are going to be looked at as well. The whole digital assessment side of things is going to be looked at further as well, and a review and update of the guidances across the board, both in terms of the guidance that local authorities rely on, landlord and housing related professionals guidance, and better engagement and interaction with both landlords and tenants with the introduction of a new tenants guidance as well. So it's probably, you know, I doubt this is coincidental that there is very much parallel working across building safety, fire safety, and the Housing Act 2004 reforms, which will hopefully enable a consistent approach in terms of at the other end.
Thank you very much, Alan. Mark, do you want to kind of expand on the themes? It seems to be coming back to communication and intelligence sharing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to say something again about training and expertise, because you know, the 2004 Housing Act, which environmental health officers implement for local authorities, it may well have implied that it dealt with the exterior construction of buildings in the original legislation, but that's not how anybody I know interpreted it or implemented it until this addendum came along as a result of Grenfell and the ACM issue. And so if you look at, you know, the people who work with authorities as environmental health officers, their training, their expertise over the last 15 years, it doesn't deal with these issues and the exterior building. It now needs to. So there's a whole piece there around training and development for health departments across the country, which I think, you know, it takes time to bring people up to that level of knowledge and confidence to have consistency in decision making around what is a category 1, category 2 hazard, how are those scores going to be done. So, you know, my experience to date is that there haven't been many of those kinds of assessments done, and where they have been done, they haven't been that consistent in their results, and they probably haven't given the kind of results that the government was looking for in terms of this being a really strong tool in terms of dealing with cladding that has failed fire safety tests. And there is a real challenge within HHSRS about, you know, what is sufficient hazard to actually bring in a duty for a local authority to take action. So yeah, I think that debate needs to be resolved definitely through this reform.